1, 2, 3, 4. Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk. Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk.
Welcome to Spock Talk, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and child care become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died?
Last episode, we talked about Spock's personal finances. In our last full episode about Dr. Benjamin Spock, we're going to talk about what we've learned on our journey into Spockology.
We're wrapping up, but this doesn't have to be goodbye. Listeners, you can subscribe to our It's My Screen Time 2 podcast, where we review movies and TV made for kids.
And the door is not entirely closed on a second season someday, maybe. Stay subscribed to our feed, and you'll get to hear about what we're up to, our recommendations for other independent podcasts, maybe even some bonus new Spock, Old Spock episodes.
Yes. Let us know what you like best about Spock Talk. Leave it in a review on Apple Podcasts or send us an email to spocktalkpodcast@gmail.com.
We're going to talk about what we've learned, but first, Katie, is it okay if we talk a little bit about our feelings?
I think Spock would support a feelings check-in, but only with our respective psychoanalysts. I don't know that he would consider this publicly available podcast to be the appropriate venue. But, you know, we're enlightened 21st century women. So, yes, of course, let's talk about our feelings.
I would have really liked this podcast when I was a first-time parent. I'm sad that it wasn't around when I was trying to find a good baby book and balance the advice I got from family members with the medical advice I got from our pediatrician. And I'm also feeling a little guilty about spending so much time on this one male authority figure. Although anyone who's listened to even 5 minutes of any episode of Spock Talk knows that this is not a mega exercise or nostalgia for the 20th century.
You know, Deborah, we have to learn about the patriarchy in order to dismantle it. I think it's crucial that women take a long, hard look at the degree to which they've allowed men to dictate how they live their lives. And that includes interrogating why we're still reaching for a resource originally written by a man who, in a lot of ways, distanced himself very explicitly from women's knowledge and wisdom when it came to childbirth and child rearing.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, no shame in our game.
How about you? How are you feeling?
You know, I'll rail against the patriarchy all day long, but I think it's been really valuable to me personally to consider Spock as a whole person, influenced by his upbringing and the world he inhabited. Just a good reminder to take a step back and do that when we can in our everyday lives. Not always in the form of a 10-episode podcast series, but we're just so encouraged, especially now, to divide people into us or them, good or evil. It's been really refreshing and a nice reminder that people aren't so simple.
Speaking of our feelings, let's listen to a brief clip from Dr. Benjamin Spock taking a call from a mother talking about her feelings during a call-in show on Minnesota Public Radio in 1984 and the exchange they have about how baby and child care made parents feel.
If you did nothing else, you made us feel that whatever we did, it was probably okay, and the kid would survive, and it took away a lot of the intense anxiety.
Yeah, I'm so delighted you make this point, because that really was what the book was written for, is to reassure parents. And I leaned over backwards not to criticize them. Previous books had tended to take a somewhat condescending or strongly disapproving attitude. Look out, stupid, if you don't do just what I say, you will ruin your kid. And I knew that doesn't help parents, that it hurts them. So I wrote it to be reassuring, and I'm delighted that you heard that.
It's the tone. The tone made it popular. Obviously, we've learned a lot about Dr. Benjamin Spock as we made this podcast. So let's Guy Raz this. How did this get made style?
You're referencing the wrong Guy Raz podcast. I clearly only listen to WoW in the World. We were knocking around ideas for a new podcast, and comparing the early baby and childcare with the contemporary baby and childcare seemed like a funny concept. I think a lot of the initial appeal was just to point at early childcare advice and laugh at how ridiculous it seems to modern audiences. And while that was funny to us, we didn't necessarily think it would sustain a whole show. And you just jumped right in and were pretty quick to see the potential in Spock.
Yeah, we started with baby cages outside of apartment windows in New York City. And that helped us learn that Spock was actually a pretty interesting public figure, super prolific author, very long and interesting life. But we didn't want the podcast to sound like a Wikipedia bulleted list of all his milestones and accomplishments.
So we talked a lot about the conversational podcasts that we like, the ones where where there are two hosts and one host teaches the other host about a particular topic. My favorites that I mentioned as inspiration were the lovely You're Wrong About and its follow-up maintenance phase. Plus, for just an extra peek behind the curtain, it just made sense to let Deborah educate me on Spock bit by bit because she was the driving force behind the research and had all the insight. I've just been here to crack wise.
But I just have a little more time for reading stuff because my kids are older than yours.
Sure, well, we'll say that's why.
Dividing up the life events and controversies and larger social impacts of Spock's career has been a fun way to put together an episodic examination of Spock himself, and also how ideas and ideology around parenting and childcare are produced in general. I want to talk about whether or not we like Spock. What do you think personally about Spock? Do you like him?
Yes, on balance, I think I do. I mean, we have to be careful about giving people passes because they were, quote unquote, of their time. But I think this is a descriptor that really works for Spock. He was able to do what he did thanks in large part to his role as an educated, white male in mid-century America. His early views reflect those typical of educated white men in mid-century America. But I also think it's clear that his thinking evolved on a variety of topics, and he wasn't the static figure. He recognized that his thinking had to change and that it should change. So yes, I think I like him for that evolution. I don't, on balance, feel uncomfortable about my general view of him as a kindly, avuncular cultural presence. I am, however, still incredibly mad about his treatment of his first wife.
Totally. I just watched a documentary about Spock from 1995 titled Ben Spock, Baby Doctor, and it had commentary from Mortimer Zuckerman, who said, quote, "The power of Spock and the importance of Spock is that he is at the very center of the very most momentous change in American character in the 20th century. The change from thoughts essentially conditioned by scarcity to a character that's essentially conditioned by abundance." And as a tangential aside, I didn't know who Mortimer Zuckerman was, but he's
Nope,
like
was just going to ask.
Yeah, so this is in keeping with like the magazine appreciation motif that has run throughout the podcast. I don't think he was a billionaire in 1995, but he became one partially because he sold Fast Company magazine for like over $300 million. And he like he's the publisher, editor of U.S. News and World Report.
All right, Mort.
We've been hard on Spock. We've made fun of his clothes.
No, we did not make fun of his clothes. We appreciate his clothes.
We appreciate his clothes. We made fun of his privilege. We've pegged him as a bad parent and a neglectful spouse, but I do like him too, especially his political activism, which I find very inspiring, and his public persona is very charming. I've spent a ton of time reading about him, reading works by him, searching for information, thinking about him. maybe most impactfully listening to recordings of him. And I think in a weird parasocial way, you might say that I have a little bit of a history crush on Dr. Spock.
You know what? I think he would love that.
You know the New York Times book review by the book interview where they ask an author who they'd invite to a literary dinner party? Any 3 writers living or dead? Dr. Benjamin Spock would definitely make my literary dinner party guest list.
I mean, it would guarantee a fun party, right? The man was a good time.
Mm-hmm. When we started this project, I did not think that we would really be using the Spock advice. IRL.
What, because you were already scraping the brown bits off of cooked meat and serving it to your children? Or you just thought that your days of dealing with milk scum were over?
Honestly, I have found the vintage baby and childcare advice kind of helpful. I find myself explaining to my kids sometimes why I sound crabby. Spock would say cross. And that kind of resets the tone of my interactions with my kids in a good way. And I totally picked that up from Spock's book. My kids don't like it if I use my strict mom voice. So if I'm like, because I already asked you to do something 6 times, that's why my tone is escalating. And then they get it. And they'll be like, that makes sense. I was ignoring you. And that's an interaction I wasn't having with them before I read Baby and Childcare all the way through. Has this affected your meat scraping or your parenting at all?
I mean, it really has upped my meat scraping game. I think it's more just a general consciousness. It's helpful to have the mechanics of parenting and why we do what we do just front of mind as you're going through your day-to-day tasks. So I don't want to say it could be anything, but the fact that we've been doing this long exploration of Spock has made me interrogate my interactions with my kids more than I normally would, and maybe work out some kinks or just be more thoughtful in our interactions.
Sure. But I wish that when I was a new parent, I would have known more about how infant and child care advice is manufactured and how it evolves.
Yes, because everything feels like the definitive solution, right? At that time, like you're so desperate, you'll believe anything. And it's hard because you're exhausted to stop and think about how ultimately artificial a lot of those choices are. Something that sounds really off the wall and out there today may have actually been practical under different circumstances. Like we made fun of Mildred Spock for making her kids sleep outside, but maybe the air quality in their house was bad. Similarly, it's been refreshing to see how cyclical it is. There's truly nothing new under the sun. I'm sure there's a best-selling book out there right now preaching the benefits of having your kids sleep under the open sky. Maybe for different reasons, like fostering an appreciation for nature, appreciating the planet before it becomes any more actively hostile towards us, something having to do with signaling the aliens. I don't know, but it's the same advice.
Right. I wish that expert parenting advice were based on a neat scaffolding system where one expert lays down one layer and then the next expert just improves on that very intentionally, like a neat little Lincoln log structure.
I see your reference to non-toxic wooden toys, and I will raise you by saying it's actually more like a game of pickup sticks with advice just randomly stacked higgledy-piggledy on top of other advice with some weird outliers that are depressingly easy to pick up.
That's a really good metaphor.
Thank you. Although sometimes it does seem to have worked very neatly, like take the Back to Sleep campaign. That was really an evidence-based change in how babies were taken care of, where they used to be put on their tummies to sleep, and then the advice changed to put them on their back, and the rate of SIDS went down. So that is one small instance in which things worked out logically.
Right. But even that is not straightforward. Recently,
No, don't tell me that. No, don't. I don't want to hear that. That was like my bright spot. Okay, fine. Go ahead.
I just read an article in The Cut about how TikTok and Instagram communities encourage co-sleeping against American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations.
I feel like there was just, an article, maybe it was The Cut or maybe it was The Atlantic, that was like, are we all secretly co-sleeping?
Yeah, that's the one. So parenting advice can swing wildly from one set of values to another, and we know that Spock's advice was an antithesis to the strict baby schedules that preceded his career.
I feel like I'm really leaning into the panic of early parenting in this episode, but like when people are scared and looking for some certainty and advice about something as vast and amorphous as parenting, they don't want to hear all things in moderation.
Mm-hmm.
They want surefire solutions, and that's what parenting books try to provide to mixed results. My husband and I joke that whenever we call the pediatrician, the response is, well, it could be nothing or he could be dying. Sometimes you'll pay anything for the answer to just be X.
Yes.
You know, like just to have one thing.
Totally. I just want an answer. Profit is a huge factor in like everything about American life, but also in the production and dissemination of information. We did that whole episode about why Spock was such a prolific author because he needed cash to pay for hospital bills. If just one parent somewhere out there listens to this podcast and our conversation encourages them to evaluate a source of parenting advice, then I can feel like the podcast was a success.
Yes, yes. Especially now when we're inundated by so much crap advice from the internet. Information literacy is something we worry about our kids missing out on as they scroll through Instagram or TikTok, but it's something we have to remind ourselves to pursue even as parents seeking advice. Do you want to give a little information literacy lesson here?
I would love to give an information literacy lesson. So by evaluate a source, we mean checking like who is the person writing or saying the advice? What are their credentials? Are they affiliated with a credible organization, or are they affiliated with a group or organization that has a bias or an ulterior motive or agenda? You need to take a look at when the information was produced. Is it current or is it out of date? Do they cite any sources? And what are those sources? And why was the information created? And who's the intended audience?
Right. And if it's a social media post, you have to try and figure out if they're selling something or if it's sponsored by some entity. And ask yourself, are they expressing a personal opinion or are they representing the organization they work for? Have they provided some of the clues to whether a source is credible that Deborah just helpfully mentioned? I know that seems a little extra for a social media post, but it's true. People can say anything on the internet.
And I think it's a good idea to talk about influencer culture because that's where a lot of parents are getting advice and instructions on how to raise their kids. I think books are still a factor, but not for everybody. My beloved magazines, probably not. Facebook groups, yes. And TikToks, definitely.
Oh my gosh, Spock would have killed at TikTok.
Oh, he would have been really good at TikTok.
Uh-huh.
I slightly wonder if social media is a way for new parents who might be at a loss for generationally passed down information and kind of isolated to gather folk wisdom in a crowdsource way. Like in my day, it was baby center forums, not TikToks.
Right. And I mean, this has been the double-edged sword of modern social media across the board, right? Like, on one hand, it's been great at creating supportive communities for people who are isolated or otherwise marginalized. On the other, it's become a place where it's extremely easy to disseminate and popularize ideas that are hateful, harmful, and just plain wrong. So yes, use social media to reclaim your folk wisdom, but keep your wits about you. Not everyone on the internet has your best interests at heart. And if you find the barrage of internet advice overwhelming, or it creates feelings of shame or panic in you, you can remove yourself from that conversation. Buy books published by professionals, or listen to your mother's or your neighbor down the street who seems to know what she's talking about. It doesn't have to happen online.
That's such good advice. I think that probably going forward, I'm going to be more critical about information written for parents and about parents. I don't think there is any one perfect book that tells parents how to parent. I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but intentionally or not, a lot of popular information has an agenda. Even if the information is very science-based and evidence-based, it's never like totally neutral. You can't just remove the author's worldview or historical perspective or unconscious bias. If we circle back to our information professional training, what's best is reading widely from a diverse collection of ideas. If you have a range of sources and a range of perspectives, you can make your own informed decisions about how to best parent your kids.
Although this is not helpful if you're up in the night with a baby who might have an ear infection. In that case, my personal advice is to just have one solid tome that you trust that catalogs these early ailments. It could be Spock, it could be Sears, it could be Mayo Clinic, whatever. Have the one source that can be your rock, and maybe limit yourself to that and one internet resource in the middle of the night. One you already know and have gotten some solid advice from in the past. Resist the rabbit hole. Your exhausted brain cannot handle it at that time.
So I would like to mention our sources, our references. I was surprised while looking up information about Spock how much of it is inaccessible. We are in a weird little point in time in the news cycle where there's a lot of information highlighting what AI can do. When I read about AI, experts in the technology claim that AI can do what it does because it's gobbled up basically all of the text ever generated by humans on the internet. But it hasn't. There's so much that's not on the internet.
Yes, as former librarians, we're so used to this "but Google" argument. People who think everything is online, but it's not, particularly not historical information. Digitizing documents is expensive and time-consuming. A lot of institutions with a lot of important historical information have neither the time nor money to put large amounts of their collections online.
Yeah, a lot of the Spock information I used is print only. And I mean books that are only available from libraries because they are older books that are out of print and not in bookstores. And I also read a lot of newspaper articles. Some are online for free, but a lot were only available through library databases, which meant that I had to visit my public library's website, log in with my library card, retrieve the article from a database. And a few articles I could only get because my public library had to make an interlibrary loan request from another library with a different database subscriptions.
How many librarians' days did you make? Like, they must have been so happy to be needed in this way.
I don't know if I made their day.
Made their day or they were annoyed. I guess it depends on the circumstances.
I certainly affected many librarians' days. For a couple of articles, I had to physically go to a university library, get a visitor pass, access the database from a computer there, and get the article that way. Same with that documentary with Mortimer Zuckerman that I mentioned. I couldn't stream it. I couldn't get a DVD of it. I had to go to the university and watch it there. That's just the nature of older information. A lot of it is digitized, but it's not on Google. A lot of information about Spock, too, is just inaccessible. There are recordings of his speeches and television appearances that I would love to watch, but they're not available. Like the Dr. Spock television show, only 4 episodes have been digitized. And it costs a lot to get additional episodes digitized. And I don't know if anybody's going to do that.
I am just really dismayed that I can get all 155 episodes of Sea Hunt, a series about a freelance scuba diver that aired from 1958 to 1961 on YouTube, but no episodes of the Dr. Spock TV show. And I've looked. Looking itself, by the way, was not unentertaining.
Mm-hmm.
I did come across a clip from the Carol Burnett show in which the actual identity of the Invisible Man was revealed to be Mr. Spock. Wrong Spock, but still funny.
I am sorry to all of the Star Trekkies who clicked on the link to our podcast only to discover wrong Spock. For such an iconic person who died not that long ago, who had an enormous amount of media coverage about him, it serves as a good example of the limitations of old media technology. Syracuse University holds the Benjamin Spock and Mary Morgan Papers archive, and in their inventory of recordings by and about Spock, lots of the formatting is listed as VHS and audio cassette tapes. I would love, Katie, to hear your archivist perspective on this.
Things don't just get automatically upgraded to new technology formats unless there's concrete demand and sufficient funds. In my experience, most archivists would love for their materials to be available to the widest possible audience, but it's just not practical to digitize everything given the massive amount of material and the small amount of staffing and funding. Many institutions only have the means to house historical materials and do their best to make sure they don't degrade further. VHS and audio cassette tapes are at least still readable with technology that is fairly readily available. At least those Spock recordings aren't on wax cylinder or nitrate film. It is true that most archival institutions are engaged in digitization efforts on at least some level, and they are conscious of what items in their collections are the most requested and could benefit from more efficient access. So perhaps we've inspired a wave of Spock researchers who will encourage a formatting upgrade for those Spock and Morgan papers. We can dream of seeing those Dr. Spock episodes yet, and listeners, you better believe we'll do a podcast about them.
Oh, I really want to watch the one on Christmas hysteria.
Yes. It's just that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Jingle All the Way.
Speaking of research and archives and how much we love libraries, we have some acknowledgments. I got help from a lot of librarians in the Twin Cities, the Hennepin County Public Library staff, and the staff at the McGrath Library and the Wilson Library at the University of Minnesota. Andy Lancet at the WNYC Archives provided us with an incredible audio file to work with. Minnesota Public Radio gave us permission to use 72 seconds of audio, and they charged us $100 for it. A volunteer attorney with Minnesota Lawyers for the Arts talked me through my copyright questions.
The Library of Congress's Moving Image Research Center librarian answered our questions about the Dr. Spock TV show. The Syracuse University Special Collections Research Center staff answered a lot of questions and provided us with materials from the Dr. Benjamin Spock and Mary Morgan papers. Shella Fazy designed our incredible cover art. And where would independent podcasters be without all of the YouTubers who make Audacity tutorials? Thank you.
Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. Katie, I've been saving this one. It's my favorite, from the 1957 edition on the hard work of parenting and reward. Spock wrote, "Of course, parents don't have children because they want to be martyrs, or at least they shouldn't. They have them because they love children and want some of their very own. They also love children because they remember being loved so much by their parents in their own childhood. Taking care of their children, seeing them grow and develop into fine people, gives most parents, despite the hard work, their greatest satisfaction in life. This is creation. This is our visible immortality." End quote. Our visible immortality is how, ever since reading that passage, is how I think of and refer to my children. Time to wake up my visible immortality. Time to take my visible immortality to school. I'm going to schedule a dentist appointment for my visible immortality.
Well, your visible immortality needs to have straight teeth.
Right. Do you have a favorite Spock passage or quotation?
Well, certainly nothing as lovely or profound as that. But I do appreciate the take a breath, take a step back tone I encountered in the early portions of the 10th edition.
Mm-hmm.
A quote that I really liked was, quote, "Children are driven from within to grow, explore, experience, and build relationships with other people. A lot of parenting lies in just letting your child follow these urges. Children are resilient. They make mistakes and suffer setbacks, then keep on growing. Don't you just instantly feel calmer after reading that?
I do. I have been trying to think about a way to wrap this up because we've reached the end of our Spocktastic journey, and it's been a great time digging into the foundation of contemporary parenting advice. I have a feeling that a lot of our listeners are parents, and I'd love to come up with something pithy that we can impart to our audience as we sign off.
We've certainly lifted the curtain a little bit to show that parenting experts, while they may be writing from a very sincere place in their heart, that parenting advice is not value neutral, is it? It's just like anything else in this complicated world. It's a nugget of good intentions wrapped in layers and layers of bias, social constructions, and economic realities.
I would love to end with a good, succinct way to summarize how parents should interact with parenting advice.
I think I know where you're going here. Should we say it?
I think we should say it.
Okay.
Trust yourself. Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk.
See this episode's show notes for our references. If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
Special thanks to Minnesota Public Radio for that audio clip. Stay subscribed in case we ever again talk Spock.
Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk. Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk, Spock Talk.
TikTok right in there.
Subscribe, rate, or review.